Alrighty, Matthew, if you would like to kick off tonight's event, that would be lovely. Matthew is hosting for us this evening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Victoria. Looks like we have all of our key people here. So I'm really glad, and lots of people on this call. So thank you so much for being here, taking part of your Sunday to be with us. It's really great to see everyone here. It's an exciting time in the party. You know, we have a leadership race, which means that it's a really great time to connect with the 23,000 people who are members of the Green Party. It's also an exciting time to see those membership numbers increase, for us to do outreach, to get out there, to talk to Canadians or people who have been thinking about joining the Green Party and now want to say, hey, I really want to be part of this. So it's a really exciting time. In a moment, we'll hear from one of the candidates for the Green Party of Canada leadership, which is obviously Anna Maypaul. And she'll set the stage for our main speaker tonight, which is Elizabeth May, who I think really needs no introduction for the people here on this call. But we're really great to have you here, Elizabeth. Small housekeeping. There will be a interactive fundraiser / Dutch auction that's happening tonight. We will be accepting donations later in the event, which you can do through the chat box. Both donations and pledges. If you don't want to make your pledge public, which we completely understand, you know, if this was a live in-person event, there'd be ways to do that. You can send a direct message directly to Rachel N, who's in there. So do make use of that as well. I now like to pass it over to Heather Morigo, who is going to do our land acknowledgement. Go ahead there, Heather.
Merci. Okay. Bonjour. I'm Heather Morgeau. Let us begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the lands inhabited by Indigenous people for millennia prior to the Europeans coming and colonizing this space. We're grateful for the opportunity to meet here and thank the generations of people who have cared for this land, the Indigenous people who have been stewards of Turtle Island and their historical connections to it. For myself, I assert the sovereignty of Indigenous people across Turtle Island by observing the land acknowledgement. My grandmothers are from the Métis Nation, the Kutzanaha Nation, and Settler Nations. I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta and a visitor residing in Mohkinstsis, which is within the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, today known as Calgary, Alberta, within the territory of Treaty 7. In Toronto, we acknowledge the traditional ancestral territories of the Ojibwe, the Ashambi, and in particular, the Huron-Wendat and the Huron-Sea, whose traditional territory Anime is gathering today. We wish to reference the territories that were signed in regards to these land settlements, which include the Toronto Purchase, Territory 13, in 1805. In British Columbia, we acknowledge that Elizabeth May is gathering in the traditional territories of the Coast Salish, and I would like to ask everyone listening to please take a moment to acknowledge the territories you reside within in the chat boxes below. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Yeah, that's these land acknowledgements are really important. They're a small step on the way to reconciliation. So thank you again so much for doing that. I'd now like to invite Anna Maypaul to set the stage for our discussion tonight. We'll be speaking about a green recovery, just transition, green jobs, and all of this in the context of a climate emergency, which is still a very, very important topic for us. So take it away, Anna May.
rookie mistake. Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you so much to you, Heather, for your presence and for the welcome, Megwich. As Matthew said, my name is Annemie Paul. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. Thank you so much for having us and for taking time out of your weekend to participate in this conversation with myself and with Elizabeth. This is my second time in less than a week that I've been out on the prairies. We did an event in Alberta earlier this week with Alberta Greens, and we're also going to be doing an event very soon with Saskatchewan Greens. And so I hope to be able to visit all the prairies and territories virtually in the days and weeks to come, hopefully more than once. I'm very excited about our conversation this evening, particularly because we are talking about a just transition, whether it's in the context of the recovery that we will inevitably be undergoing. Just to acknowledge, of course, we are not there yet. This is still a very real pandemic for many people, and many people are suffering all across this territory and also in other places around the world. But we need to already be thinking about the recovery and what a just transition would look like. A just transition is particularly important and meaningful to me because my brother works in the oil patch out on the prairies. And so when I think about this and when I think about what I want his future to look like and the future of my niece and nephews to look like, I want it to be one that is sustainable. I want to make sure that the transition leaves no one behind. And so I'm very interested to hear Elizabeth's thoughts about this evening, to hear your comments and questions about that. And just for you to know that, of course, I would never support any transition or any party that didn't have a meaningful and workable solution and pathway for my brother's future. In terms of why we're doing this evening tonight and the way that we're doing it, we want to remember and look back to who we are as a party. And so why are we doing this fundraiser with Elizabeth tonight? It's very important to remember that as a party, we are an evidence-based party. And we're an evidence-based party that when we see evidence of injustice or inequality, we act. We don't wait idly by and hope that someone else comes up with a solution. We are the instigators of a positive change. And so, we need to look at what the evidence tells us about certain things in relation to our party and face some of those evidence-based truths, even if they are hard truths. One of those important facts to remember is that the Green Party of Canada has a crisis of diversity. And the evidence tells us that we are the least diverse of all of the major political parties in Canada. We ran the least diverse slate of candidates in the last election, and that includes the People's Party of Canada. And after almost 40 years as a party, we have not made the progress that we certainly would have wanted to make given our core values and given how important working on injustice and inequality is to us. And so we, instead of remaining passive and hoping that change would happen organically, we have decided to take positive action, and that is the Green way. And so I am very pleased and grateful to the party and also to Elizabeth for walking the talk. I certainly won't be the only candidate to benefit from her generosity and for the understanding that the party has in relation to this issue. But I appreciate being the first, and it reinforces to me all the reasons that I became a Green in the first place when I see us taking this kind of positive action. So without further ado, because I know we want to get to our special guest this evening, I'm going to pass the floor over to Elizabeth. Now we are talking about the recovery in terms of a just transition. And we're certainly looking forward to your remarks in relation to that and your questions. But let's talk about that, knowing that of course there is the opportunity for us to expand beyond that if we have the desire to do it. But we're very grateful to all of you for being here this evening, and I'm going to pass it along to the woman that needs no introduction at all, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks.
I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thanks, Anami, and I acknowledge, as I saw in the chat line, a number of other people in the same territory, acknowledging the traditional territory of the Sanak people, and Haishka Siam. Raise my hands to all of you for joining us tonight. And I'm pleased to see 80 people at this point. That's really, really good and encouraging. And I want to, again, underscore what Anami said. I'll not be endorsing anybody running for leadership in this campaign. But compared to when I ran for leader 14 years ago, and there's some of you, I know some of you on this Zoom chat were there as Greens even before me, and part of that leadership race in 2006. The entry fee level was, as far as I remember, it was $1,000. It might have been $2,000, but it wasn't a significant factor. And this election, and I think it's part of the maturity and growth of the party, that anyone running for leadership has to be able to give the party $30,000 as obviously a full commitment. It's not anything you get back. And on top of that, raise whatever funds you need to run a campaign. And who knew? Of course, we didn't know. Initially, it was $50,000. It's been reduced to $30,000 in light of the fact that we're in a pandemic. But it's very hard to imagine how anyone fundraises in a pandemic. The Green Party is also obviously at the national level, not doing the I was going to say repetitive, but that sounds pejorative. We do a lot of online fundraising, and you get a lot of emails. I know all of you do. Parties cut back on all of that, and so, but the candidates for leadership have to raise $30,000 each, and it's particularly a burden, a challenge for candidates who represent those groups that are sometimes referred to as equity seeking. So this was suggested to me by the party as a way of being able to, as Anami says, to walk the talk, to do something different in the case of diverse candidates. I'm likely to be doing events with other candidates as well who don't represent diverse groups, but the fundraising portion, which is what tonight is specifically to try to overcome some of the steeper hurdles, shall we say, of candidates coming from equity-seeking groups. So let me just set that aside and move on to the topic for tonight, which is terribly important, which is the concept of just transition, capital J, capital T. And let me just say that the concept of just transition is deeply embedded in climate work and has been for a long time. So it's in the pandemic, we're looking at it in terms of how do we transition out of pandemic and reopen our economy. But way before there was COVID-19, there was a need for just transition strategies. There was a need for a just transition act. And it's certainly for those of you who are candidates in 2019 and in 2015, you'll know that party policies spoke to the issues of how do we ensure that the workforce currently dependent on the fossil fuel sector doesn't become vulnerable, don't become the victims of a transition. So going way back, just transition has been part of our strategies. If you go back to 2015 and the negotiations of the Paris Agreement, and it was largely Canadian leadership around this point, I have to say, a lot of Canadian labor unions were there in Paris to make sure that the Paris Agreement itself referenced firmly the need for just transition, which is at this point language that has its baggage that's heavily coded to mean supporting organized labor, making sure that any decision to move off fossil fuels has an equally strong commitment to transitioning the workforce, which has extraordinarily transferable skills. It's a highly skilled workforce for the most part. Those skills can transfer quite easily to many forms of renewable energy, to other work as in retrofitting buildings for energy efficiency. All of those pieces are workable. And I think it's significant to reflect on the fact that just transition is embedded in the Paris Agreement. Canada also, we happen to have been, I mean, there are many things about federal government policy on climate where I will not be at all complimentary, but one piece that was quite cutting edge was before the 2019 election. So under the first mandate of the Liberals, Catherine McKenna, who when she was Minister of Environment, commissioned a panel to investigate what would just transition look like. And it was co-chaired by the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, Hassan Youssef, and the executive director of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, Lois Corbett. And they basically enunciated the principles that we adopted as Greens. We put their platform, their specific recommendations, even the dollar amount of what they thought was necessary. They were mandated specifically to look at the coal sector. As we go off coal, what should be done for workers in the coal sector? And they came up with some very strong principles that we embedded in our platform, and we embedded the $400 million that they thought should be spent for the coal sector as part of our platform in 2019. Now, it's an interesting thing when we reflect on this as Greens. It's generally the assumption of people in media, particularly, that the New Democratic Party is most aligned with organized labor. But it was quite interesting. It was a number of years ago when our convention was in Ottawa. We'd commissioned some polling, or maybe he'd been doing the polling elsewhere, but Envisioning and Frank Graves spoke to convention. I don't know how many of you were there that day, but it was fascinating to find that Green Party supporters and Green Party members were more supportive of organized labor than NDP supporters and members. So we have some, we have some really strong commitment. I guess it's definitely part of our commitment to social justice and our core green values, that contrary to what some of the spin is, particularly from another party that shall remain nameless but is usually wearing orange, that we're somehow not progressive, that we're not supporting organized labor, that we're austerity focused, all that kind of nonsense. We have a very strong set of policies that support organized labor, and according to this polling, our membership and supporters are more pro supporting organized labor than the NDP. Someone's asking for a link to that poll. I'd have to go back and ask the party staff to dig it out because it was presented at convention in 2014 in Ottawa. So let me just say that in terms of the just transition, where are we now that we're in a pandemic? Even more brace coming out of this enormous economic crisis. How do we ensure that what's done next ensures that the workforce doesn't feel vulnerable, doesn't feel as though there's going to be a trapdoor opening under them where they won't be able to pay their mortgage, they won't be able to feed their family? I quite often share the experience I had as a maritimer before I moved to British Columbia, but in the late 80s, I did a lot of work with the fishing community, trying to protect what was left of the North Atlantic cod stocks that were headed for disaster. It's a long story. Most of you will know it. But the failure of governments to act, to listen to the inshore fishermen and protect that resource led to essentially the overnight loss of jobs immediately for 30,000 people. The fishers, the workers in the fish plants, all of them lost their work overnight. And the programs that came out afterwards were completely wrong for that workforce. They didn't help. In any case, it was a tough lesson, and I've brought some of that experience into looking at what does a just transition look like. It has to start with thinking not about each individual worker is going to get a check, but what is effective to ensure that entire communities are able to innovate. That's one of the principles that I really like that came out of the Just Transition for Coal Workers report, was you go in and you should consult with every community that's going to be affected. I can tell you from talking to Hassan Youssef after his work on this committee that he and the committee were strongly advised by government not to go in to the coal sector communities, that they would be just absolutely ripped to shreds and that they shouldn't go in there and consult. And they insisted on going in there, and in every community, the conversation was welcomed, because people want to know, what does it look like for me? Where is this going? What's it going to be like? And by going into communities and opening up the conversation, it became extremely constructive, and it really informed where their commission report came out. So for us as Greens, I think number one, I mean, justice and social justice and a just transition, and you don't want workers to feel vulnerable. Guaranteed livable income is going to help here, folks, for sure. If you start with a guaranteed livable income, then everybody knows the trapdoor isn't going to open up under you in such a way that you're really in trouble. On top of that, workers in the fossil fuel sector have been paid well for the most part, and their lifestyles expect a certain amount of income. So you need to pay attention to what level of income, what level of work is going to be required, so people don't feel that they are significantly vulnerable. And that's where it's really important to look at the opportunities in the sectors that are up and coming and growing. Renewable energy particularly, also the huge volume of work that was, by the way, all of this, you can go back and reference it in the Mission Possible documents, but all of it, you know, there's work for 4 million skilled tradespeople in Canada to upgrade our built infrastructure. That's a stat I got from the construction industry itself. The work for electricians, for plumbers, for carpenters, to retrofit every building, to put in heat pumps, to improve the insulation, to put in renewable energy on the roofs. I mean, we have the potential for most buildings in Canada to be carbon zero and potentially carbon negative. But that's going to take, it's a wonderful project because it is cross-country and it involves workers in every part of the country. It's not one, in contrast to fossil fuels, where we've seen the problem identified in the report of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the problem of man camps, the problem of workers in a construction facility where they're miles, even thousands of kilometers from their home, and you know, if you talk about this, I know that Justin Trudeau mentioned it once and was lambasted by those workers who said, well, you're saying, or I can remember seeing these images on national television, you're saying my father, who's a construction worker, is a rapist, shame on you. Well, not every construction worker, obviously, not every person working at one of these work camps in remote areas, such as building the Trans Mountain Pipeline or building Site C Dam, or work that, obviously it's not lambasting everybody, but the evidence is incontrovertible that these locations are hotspots for abuse of many kinds, for physical violence, for drug use, and that Indigenous women and girls using the highways nearby with no access to decent public transit and hitchhiking are extremely vulnerable. So these issues do tend to interlock and interrelate. It's one of the reasons that Greens really want to see the work that takes place in a just transition being as community-based as possible, so that people are working in the communities they call home, that they're able to stay there, able to be there, and that's an extremely important part of what we're doing as Greens, is to build strong, resilient communities. So yes, it's a commitment to social justice. Yes, it's a commitment to be able to say out loud, every person who wants a job in this country should have a job in this country. And if they need to upskill, we should support that. Their skills are largely transferable. But I'll finish this rant very quickly and then open up, because I see we have questions that are coming up. That one of the places where, and I can share with you how hard we worked as a Green Caucus, Paul Manley, Jenica Atwin, and I, as soon as we heard rumors of fossil fuel bailouts, we went to work behind the scenes. We shared a lot of information with cabinet ministers and parliamentary secretaries, wherever we found someone willing to listen, and said, look, if you're going to help the fossil fuel sector in this pandemic, put the money into helping the workers and create a program for cleaning up orphaned and abandoned wells. That's where the money should go. That's where the workers should go. It's what needs to be done. And there's an overlap with renewables that many of you will know. Some of you, I see my friends from Calgary here who've got my cowgirl hat sitting in your closet. So, but you know Tana Boonlert. Tana did some of this work with the Alberta government, identifying that so many of those orphaned and abandoned deep oil wells are also have potential for geothermal electricity. There's enough heat at depth at about 10% of those abandoned wells is the estimate, will have enough heat at depth to turn the turbines to create geothermal electricity, which is renewable and green. So there's a lot of excitement for me and for Greens around how do we harness what I think can be a massive transition in the way we think about our economy post-pandemic. How do we harness that to create the most jobs and have those jobs be consistent with our climate goals? And I know it's the first time we've ever endorsed anything that involved giving money to fossil fuels because we're against subsidies. And you can argue very convincingly that money to clean up orphaned and abandoned wells in Alberta, when there's a legal responsibility on the part of the companies that dug the wells in the first place to clean up the mess. But we supported this. We thought we've got to help the people in Alberta. They're going through such an economic whammy. We're not going to say no, but let's target those money. So that's a very good example of a just transition strategy, is not just the cleanup, but if we're able to see the experts in the drilling of the wells take on the cleaning up of the wells, and even better, look at geothermal electricity. And by the way, even if the 90% of abandoned wells that don't have heat at depth to drive geothermal, they do have enough heat at depth to pre-warm water and, for instance, run greenhouses. So there's, the biggest cost of geothermal is drilling the well, drilling the hole. That's your biggest cost. We have 100,000 abandoned wells in Alberta. We've got 40,000 abandoned oil wells in Saskatchewan and another couple tens of thousands in northern BC. And so the way Greens look at this is it's a job opportunity. They need to be cleaned up. And can we take this toxic liability and convert it into a source of green renewable energy? So that's a bit of our framework about how we go at this. We are pushing. It was a very sidelined, not too clear Liberal platform commitment to a Just Transition Act. Obviously, we haven't seen it yet. Normal legislation is not coming to Parliament at this time. The only legislation we're seeing is directly related to COVID-19 relief. They didn't need legislation for the $1.7 billion cleaning up oil wells project that I've just referred to. But what we do need is a Just Transition Act. And I hope that by early fall, when who knows when we'll be meeting in Parliament in any normal way. Happy to answer questions about what's going on with Parliament, because tomorrow's another moment where we're going to be accepting another set of different rules for how we function as parliamentarians. But whenever we actually see legislation, the Greens will be pushing for a Just Transition Act. So back over to you, Annemie. That took a little longer than you probably expected me to talk about it. Here we are.
No, it's such a huge topic and so incredibly important. And as you know, we've been saying in our campaign, and I'm sure that you have been saying as well, another opportunity may not come along like this for a very, very long time. And it seems like we have the opportunity to really do a lot of things at once in a way that we might not have imagined even a few months ago. just in terms of finally diversifying the economy in some of the regions that are far too dependent upon this natural resource on market, on global markets that they can't control. So doing that while at the same time helping with this transition. And I've noticed a couple of comments in the chat about the workers. And again, just learning from my brother in this respect, it's very important to be as full of solidarity as we can with the workers in this area. My brother describes the workers, he's perhaps the exception because he has a bachelor's, but he talks about the other workers on his crew, and these are mostly young men between the ages of 18 and 22 who don't have any education beyond beyond high school. And so, this is well high paying, but is certainly one of the few options that are available. And of course, they're paid so much because it's very hazardous work. Many of the men that he got to know on the rigs were in their early 20s and had lost the hearing in one or both of their ears. I mean, this is dangerous, dirty work. And so let's try to maintain as much solidarity with them as possible and understand that this is going to be a real transition that they have to go through.
Well, it's an interesting thing. And I did, some of you will remember, I did something called the Community Matters Tour and reached every province and one of 3 territories. And just between February and, well, some of the last ones straggled into summer, but mostly concentrated fashion between February and late April of last year. And in the course of that, I'm in every community in which we visited and had town hall meetings and such. I also met with mayors, and it was fascinating to hear from the mayor of Moncton how they now had a downtown homelessness and opioid crisis. And I mean, being a maritimer, originally from Cape Breton, I hadn't thought of Moncton as a place that would have an opioid crisis and this kind of thing going on downtown Moncton. She knows the returning oil sands workers who, if they were injured and they had pain meds, and so just in terms of that comment, Anna, there's a larger need for solidarity here, even that's outside of going off fossil fuels and, recovering post-pandemic. Before the pandemic hit, we already had a real social problem for communities in welcoming back former family members who come back with trauma. And so solidarity is required in many dimensions of this issue, and making sure that which is another one where I think I'm very proud of the Green Party position in the last election, which some people are catching up with us now, that we wanted, we're saying, look, in terms of the opioid crisis, we need to decriminalize. Otherwise, you can't get the mental health supports. You have to treat the opioid crisis as a national health care crisis, and we have to treat it as one that is a health crisis and not a criminal crisis. But it was an interesting experience going cross country, and certainly your brother's comment. Yes, most of the workers, I would say, we'd have to break it out, but people doing pipe fitting work, people working in drilling or electricians, highly skilled workers. But I remember when I did a town hall meeting a few years back in Fort McMurray with community leadership, and one of the things they bemoaned the fact in Fort McMurray that when they get a new RCMP officer or a new school teacher, they said it was really hard to keep them in the job as a school teacher or an RCMP officer because they could make so much more driving a truck. And so we've had some the economies, the cash economy in Fort McMurray was disconnected from the value of the work in terms of skills and training, and that has skewed the picture a bit as well. So there should be absolutely all educational supports available to people who are essentially what you just described, Anna, unskilled but highly paid.
Yeah.
Though that presents a particular challenge. Most of what we talk about as Greens is the workforce that has very transferable skills that are needed right away in the renewable energy sector.
I see that, Matthew, there's, we're going to try to squeeze in a couple of questions here, but that's really great. And as I said, I think that's, you know, you and I are certainly on the same page with this. I think it's been incredibly negligent to leave diversification so long, particularly because, as I heard from Albertan Greens just the other day, there is an incredible wealth of not just experience, but highly educated workforce that is really interested in other options. It's not as if you don't have skilled people able to do other things. And so again, this is an extraordinary opportunity that we have to take advantage of to really unleash the full you know, potential and really the existing skill sets of people in the prairies and territories.
I've been negligent in not mentioning something that I intended to mention. I almost always mention when I talk about just transition, and that's this wonderful group that was started by oil sands workers called Iron and Earth.
Yeah.
And on the Community Matters Tour when I was out in Newfoundland and Labrador, met the Iron and Earth chapter out there, people who used to be on the offshore rigs who are now installing solar panels. So it's, yes, the fossil fuel sector grabs Newfoundland, Labrador, definitely Alberta, Saskatchewan, parts of northern BC for sure, where there's fracking. I mean, by the way, if any of you think that natural gas is I don't think you'd think this because you're Greens, but natural gas is not a transition fuel. It is not green. It's what's happening right now is fracked and it has the same carbon footprint as coal. And that's the kind of natural gas that we're fighting in the Coastal GasLink through Wet'suwet'en territory. So it's fossil fuels, regardless of whether they're fracked natural gas, coal, bitumen. We have to shut down our dependence on fossil fuels. The first set of fossil fuels to be shut down will inevitably be bitumen, because the market forces are against them, as well as the carbon footprint. But as we work through this, we need to be thinking all the time, what happens to the workers? Where do they move? And I don't mean physically move from one community to another, but what sector? And ideally, again, bringing workers home to communities instead of having these flyaway. I mean, by the way, I don't know if you saw that, by the way, Annemie, that one of the work camps, I mean, these, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is that they own their own, the oil companies own their own airplanes and fly people in and out of the camps. So a number of Indigenous communities were exposed to COVID-19 from workers coming home. A number of provinces were exposed from workers coming back from work camps. And I think it's one of the real failures of the Horgan government in BC has been to keep the Site C work camps open, to keep allowing the Coastal GasLink to be building the pipeline in a pandemic through Indigenous communities. So there are a lot of interrelated issues in opening up the discussion of just transition, but our solidarity with workers has to be fundamental. We have to really make the point over and over again. So I will be quiet right now and check what we're doing with questions before we move to fundraising, because we've never done a fundraising event on Zoom. You guys are in something historic tonight, fundraising on Zoom.
Well, that's the green way, right? Making history when, one activity at a time, absolutely. But no, I mean, I guess we'll move into that relatively quickly. And I see that there are some great questions and comments. One thing that everyone should know is that all of these questions and comments are going to be saved, and we'll definitely take a look through all of them. I see Jordan Wilkie, our relatively new leader for the Green Party of Alberta online. Hi, Gordon.
Congratulations.
And we had, again, we had a great talk. And, I was asked, how do the Greens win that first seat in Alberta? And I believe a big part of it is really, making sure that we have the best plan for a just transition and for the diversification of the economy. You know, if we can really prove that we have given this the most thought, that we care the most about it, and that we're ready to use this this terrible pandemic, but the recovery period after it as a springboard toward that just transition, and that our plan is the most solid, then I think that's the way that we win it. Because I do believe that, you know, beyond my brother, but certainly that people, not just in Alberta, but the rest of the prairies and territories and regions that are really dependent upon fossil fuels, that that they're ready. And I think that Canadians in general, out of solidarity, also understand that they can't leave whole regions so fragile and so vulnerable ever again. You know, we have, this is part about making sure we take care of each other.